behalf of AAMC, we're really delighted to be on this panel today. I'll introduce myself. I'm Melissa Buron, the Director of the Art Division at the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, which is comprised of our curatorial, conservation, publications teams, and our library. And it's my great honor to introduce our panelists very briefly this morning. We have Linda Butler, who's Director of Marketing, Communications, and Visitor Experience for the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. She's actually in the office next door. And Sylvia Forney, who's Senior Curator of African Arts and Cultures at the Royal Ontario Museum. And Lance Wheeler, who's Curator of Interpretation to Mississippi Museums, who's very generously joined us just before heading to his son's birthday party, so hence his background not in the office at this moment. Our panel this morning is about global topics for local audiences, and I have to admit that I actually have a little bit of trepidation as we kind of go into this topic, because it's something that I think a lot of us are thinking about, maybe struggling with, and I'm hopeful that this webinar will give some really constructive tools and case studies and experiences on how to kind of tackle these hot topics and issues that I think we all want to participate in. So the description of our webinar is as follows, which is that we are going to explore models and methods for navigating global issues at a local scale, and that we're bringing national, regional, or historic art into a contemporary global conversation and empowering new voices to help interpret complex stories. So we're hoping, again, as I said, that case studies from our panelists will seek to address questions such as how can museums make collections and exhibitions relevant to widespread global audiences? How can they illuminate national and international issues and concerns for local audiences? And how can staff at all levels engage with challenging topics and lay the groundwork for successful community partnerships? So as I was thinking about the theme for the webinar, it sort of felt like there were two main pillars for our conversation, that I think that in this moment where museums want to be ever more relevant to our global and local audiences, how do we engage with topics that are really top of mind and of concern to people that will be visiting us either online or physically? And also that we as museums, by definition, are sort of static physical locations. We have collections, we have buildings, we are in a particular place, but we now live in a world that is so much more than this one place and experience, that we are global in such a kind of digital sense of that experience. So how do we meet the needs of both those audiences in the abstract sense that are out there, digital sphere, but how do we maintain that kind of connection to our local communities as well? So I wanted to turn back over to our panelists and give each of them an opportunity to tell us a little bit more about themselves, rather than just having me read their bios. We can go through this maybe alphabetically, and the question that I wanted to first pose to each of the panelists, in both telling us a little bit more about who you are, is why you decided that this panel would be something that was interesting for you to participate in. Oh, so Linda, you're up alphabetically.
Hi, I'm Linda Butler and oversee the marketing, communications, and visitor experience arena of the museums. It's comprised of 6 departments. And the reason why I was really interested in participating on this panel is I'm coming at it from an audience perspective. So many of the participants and perhaps listeners are coming from a curatorial background, and because we're in this changing landscape and really working, it's about working together across divisions, across departments, and really thinking about some of these global issues and how do we bring them to local audiences and vice versa, and how do we really create dialogue and long-term relationships. So it's really about collaboration and experimentation on a lot of different fronts, and that's just an area that I feel deeply passionate about and kind of bringing a different perspective to the conversation.
Thanks, Linda. Sylvia.
Okay, I muted myself. I am the curator of the African collection in a big encyclopedic museum. So I think a global perspective is very much ingrained in the things that I need to think about and I need to engage local audiences with. And also dealing with the complicated problematic history of why there is an African collection in Toronto. And what does it mean to have this collection here? And what kind of issues and conversations can be had in relationship to the arts of Africa in the 21st century multicultural metropolis of Toronto. So these are really issues that I think for somebody like me or for museums that have international collections are very much a daily concern and something that we're all really struggling and thinking through in a lot of ways, but that need concrete action and a real plan to do things really in a thoughtful way so that we don't reproduce also models of the past and also push back against the histories that allowed for museums such as mine to be built in big metropolis of the global north in the first place.
Thanks, Sylvia. And Lance.
Well, I'm Lance Wheeler. I'm the Curator of Interpretations for the Mississippi History Museum, but also the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. So I just want to clarify that because when people think of the two Mississippi museums, they always think Mississippi only has two museums. That's not true at all.
All the museums.
But the conversation today is going to really be focusing for me from the Civil Rights Museum perspective. We're not an art museum, but we do have art pieces. But dealing with the global impact of civil rights, people are always constantly coming to Mississippi. We've had people from the UK, we've had people from Tokyo asking the question, the political climate that we're in today in America, how far have we come? And what lessons can we take from the past in order to bring change for our present? And so that's why I wanted to be part of this panel, to also learn from my colleagues in the field, what are they doing in their spaces and what global conversations can we have in our museums. And so that's why I'm participating today in this webinar.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists. I also want to thank my co-organizer for the panel, Rebecca McNamara, who's the Mellon Collections Curator at the Tang Teaching Museum at Skidmore College. She was so helpful in coming up with the questions that we're going to launch into. And of course, thanks to Judith, Monica, and Casey at AAMC, wherever you are out there in the Ethernet. So in jumping into our questions, I wanted to really start by asking our panelists if you could ground this big theme that we're trying to grapple with today in a concrete kind of specific example. And if you could speak to some of the challenges and successes you've had in terms of asking your museum to take a more clear stance on a topic or subject to engage your local communities. And Sylvia, I think you wanted to kick off with this.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I can do it without taking too much space, but I'll try my best to keep it in a couple of minutes. So I work in a museum, as I said, that not only is a global museum, but they had a very complicated specific history with the African Canadian community because of a 1989 exhibition Into the Heart of Africa that was very strongly contested by the community here as an example of racist colonial representation of Africa. This was not intent of the exhibition, but this is really very much how it came across. And the museum acted really badly at that time and didn't really listen to what the protesters were saying. But anyway, long story short, when I came to the museum more than 20 years later, this was still a very open sore that tainted the relationship of the museum with the African community. It didn't help that they hired a curator of the African collection that wasn't Black. So my position also was further challenged by the fact that I had to prove that I could be a voice for the community, not being from the community. And in 2014, our museum rebranded from a building to a community connector. That was our vision, that was our new strategic mission. So I had to go to our managers and say, we can't pretend that we're a community connector if we do not address this long history of rift with the Black community. And I could do that because in the few years that I had been here, I really worked to establish a network of colleagues and allies and friends within the community that would support this idea. And I had two co-curators from the community who were willing to work with the museum and put their faces up for this colonial institution and say the ROM wants to change. So this was a real example. It's a program that lasted for 5 years. It was called Of Africa. It was co-curated by myself, Dominique Fontaine, and Julie Crooks. And it was a real challenge. It was a real challenge for the institution because we had to go back and say, we were racist in 1989 and we apologize for that. And we did an official apology in 2016 in which we actually said these words. And it was terrifying for the management because nobody wants to admit to being racist. Nobody wants to admit to have done something really wrong, such as this. But it actually helped us a lot. So we didn't know how it would go, but we did this whole process with the protesters of 1989. And really were able to work through the issues. It was not easy, it was not pretty. There was a lot of tension and a lot of uncomfortable moments. But I guess sitting with that uncomfortableness, which is something that museums that are risk averse don't like to do, can be at times really generative.
Thank you, Sylvia. Linda, did you want to chime in on that?
So most recently, we had an opportunity to present an exhibition on contemporary Muslim fashions. And so really the opportunity was to transfer a fear and a lack of cultural understanding. And before I even continue, I know someone had mentioned that they were having a hard time hearing me. So I'm being told that my audio is too low, but I have it fully up. So I'm not quite sure. Is this better if I get closer to? Yes? Okay.
I can hear you fine, but also you're next door, so maybe that's why.
Okay, great. So someone said it sounds better. I think I just need to speak. So we had an opportunity to put on an exhibition that really dealt with a lot of preconceived notions about what it meant to be a woman that was Muslim, the fashion associated with it. There's a lot of, especially with seeing, in politics, there's a lot of Islamophobia. So we put on an exhibition last fall called Contemporary Muslim Fashions, and it really allowed us to be able to break down some of those preconceived notions and ideas and start to dialogue with the public in a constructive way. So not only having dialogues with the community and assembling a community advisory group, but also being able to break down perceptual barriers for the public around what does it mean, what does being a Muslim entail, what are some of the preconceived ideas that we may or may not have, and how do we educate and create dialogue and foster a place that welcomes people from all different backgrounds, and really illuminating it through art and something that's very accessible like fashion. So that was something that we put into motion about a year ago. It definitely came with its positives and negatives. So we learned a lot in that process, and we can get into some of those more specific examples throughout this hour. But I think all in all, we walked away learning a lot, realizing how important it is for strong collaboration with the local community, and then also having our finger on the pulse of global issues and being able to put those in dialogue together.
Great. And then Lance, you come at this from a different kind of perspective and a different museum, but did you want to add anything on to that before we move to the next question?
I want to add on the history of Mississippi and the narrative that Mississippi has, the stigma still. And I think the first success is them eventually finally building the first civil rights museum in the country that's state ran by Mississippi. There was a lot of positive and a lot of negative. And so a lot of negatives were, can the African community trust the state of Mississippi to tell this civil rights story honestly and truthfully? Once the museum opened and we had a large number of African Americans for the first time for the department has been around since 1902. And so you have to think about who are running these institutions at this time period. And so creating those relationships, and since the museum's been open, we've had a lot of positive responses from the African American community. For example, one of the programs that we do, this will be the second time this year in January, is called our Martin Luther King Culture Night, where we open up the doors and allow the community to do spoken word, all the art forms, to vocalize their feelings about the government of Mississippi, the state of Mississippi, the United States. But because we can necessarily always say, because we are a state institution, but the taxpayers pay for it. And so this is their building. And so we allow them to have the opportunity to voice how they're feeling. And so that's the way that we get around kind of the state sticky situation, because they are taxpayers. And so as long as they're paying taxes, this is their museum. And so they are allowed to say what they want to say when they come to the space.
I think that's a really nice segue into the next question that I'd like to pose to the panelists. And I should also mention that if anyone tuning in to our webinar has questions, please feel free to ask them in the chats, and we'll get to them at some point. But in reflecting on this theme for the panel, I wondered if our panelists could speak to how we as museum professionals, whatever department that we're in, how we can actually better understand the kinds of questions that our communities want us to be asking. We might think we have our fingers on the pulse of the hot topics that our community really wants us to talk about, but how do you really engage with the community to understand what they authentically are asking for us to present? And maybe, Lance, that segues just from your last answer.
So what I do is I'm usually downstairs in the galleries anyway. And I'm constantly asking people, what do they want to see? What do they want to hear? And what kind of topics that we have to have. If I'm outside the museum, I'm always going to community events, city hall events, and making sure that I'm hearing what the people are saying constantly and what they want. I think that's key. Yes, I think sometimes we have to come up with the content and sometimes the topic, but I truly believe that it's my job, particularly my museum, we should be a community center, and we should be the voices of the community. And so I'm purposely in the community, and I live in my community to make sure that I'm bringing relevant topics for them. But I'm always asking questions, taking surveys in the museum. What kind of exhibitions, what kind of programs would you like to be seen or shown at the museums? Mm-hmm. I think that is key. I think that's how you start that conversation.
Have you ever found anyone not receptive to that in the galleries, or most times people really eager to talk to you about that?
People are eager to talk to me, number one, because they say you're a curator, and they're like, oh, you're young. And so I'm caught right there. And so that's how our conversations normally start. Because they're like, oh, you're young and you're Black. And I think that's the conversation. And from that conversation, what would you like to be seen here at these museums? What topics would you like us to push? And how could we push together? Or how could we work together?
And have you implemented anything from any of those community conversations?
Yes. So especially we have a lot of seasoned people come through the museum, I like to say, not old, seasoned. And so one of the things that they wanted to hear was more freedom songs, and how do freedom songs, and what is the meaning behind freedom songs? And particularly the need that they feel like young people should know what type of freedom songs were sung during the movement. And so I created a program this past summer called Freedom Song Friday, where we had actually freedom fighters or civil rights veterans, whatever you want to call them, come into the museum and teach the community freedom songs. And we did that 3 times, and that was about 150 people each program. And so I took somebody's advice.
Did you record that, or did you kind of capture it in some way for posterity?
We did. Our auditorium is highly equipped with AV, and so we recorded the videos, and we took plenty of pictures. It's just not out to the public yet.
But we'll all be able to chime into your website soon. Check that out.
Yes.
Does anyone else want to add to that?
Yes, I would love. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great. I would love to talk about this, because I feel like this is, since I'm very focused on audience and audience centricity, I think historically you can look at it in a couple of different ways. There's the how museums are operating, or certain museums are operating now, and kind of the aspiration of how we could be maybe integrating more of what the community needs. And so I find myself kind of in between those two worlds. And this is the third museum institution that I've been working for, so I've seen a variety of ways to tackle this. And I would say that historically, what I've observed in my experience is that you have the curatorial or the artistic side of the house focusing on the art and themes and how to assemble exhibitions and really thinking about the scholarship. And then you've got the public-facing aspect of the museum, so the way that you deliver the message and communicate to audiences and drive what's happening to the people and kind of engaging those. And one of the things that's been really exciting for me to participate in is kind of learning how to collect data, visitor research regularly. So our institution over the last year and a half has been collecting what we call visitor 360 surveys. So we're doing intercepts for every single person, not every single person, but a sampling of everyone that comes through the museum weekly at both institutions, both at the DeYoung and the Legion of Honor, and collecting that. Additionally, we're then doing that with our Free Saturdays program, where we've offered free admission on Saturdays to see how that's changing. But what we've started to implement is really going back to the different departments across the organization and starting to share that research and data so that it can hopefully help influence the different departments that are focusing on the making of the exhibition, the scholarship behind the exhibition, and hopefully it'll percolate some new ideas and themes. Because not in, most institutions, Lance, you obviously have a unique opportunity to go and speak to visitors directly, but that's not often the case for many curators. So I think that it's really important to bring the front of the house folks in dialogue with the artistic side of the house and really marrying those together. And that goes back to kind of collaboration and working about, what is the visitor saying? What are different community groups saying, and how can we share that with all different departments across the institution, whether it's education, curatorial, even finance, etc. And then furthermore, in addition to just surveying our visitors, speaking to them and gathering information, I think that there's an important component to building community advisory groups. And so that's something that our organization has done really well. It's run through our education department in collaboration with other departments. And it definitely has been really impactful to bring in people of different perspectives to engage with the institution and share their perspectives from a community standpoint. So, it's a combination of asking visitors what they want, but also engaging a very strategically a group of advisors or folks within the community that can help shape and mold future exhibition programming, education strands, et cetera, et cetera.
I think that kind of is something that maybe, Sylvia, in an answer you could pivot toward, which is just about, and you sort of spoke to this in your prelude to your experience and why you chose to be on the panel, but I think that there would be an interesting dialogue that we all could have around how we sustain those long-term relationships. We build community partnerships during a certain project, and then how do we make that something that is sustainable beyond that one particular project? Maybe Sylvia, you have something to.
Yeah, no, and all that Linda was saying was really interesting, and I think also we have to think that institutions work differently depending on the scale of the institution and the global their global mission. I'm one of 33 curators here at the ROM, so when we talk about community, my colleagues that does South Asian arts community, my paleontology colleagues community, they're very different. And there is a challenge that sometimes communities are actively involved and the museum is actively focusing on certain themes. And then certain themes kind of go dormant. So what I've been doing, we had a very active advisory group for Africa. I've learned the hard way that it's you don't need to waste people's time. So I don't want to ask people to come and talk to me if I do not have an opportunity for their ideas to be implemented in somewhat of a short period of time. People who do not work in museums do not understand the glacial speed of museums at times. But what I do is that I make sure to keep personal contact with all the people who were in our advisory and with other people that I meet because I go to events, because I participate in community gatherings and initiatives and lectures and, you know, things that relate to Africa and the diaspora. That's what I do anyway. So I run into people and I talk to people and I make sure that I keep them updated with the fact that even if there is not an exhibition coming up in 6 months, it's not that we're twirling our thumbs, but we're doing a lot of back of the house work and let them know what we're preparing and thinking and what's the outcome, what we're trying to fundraise for. So keep them abreast with the longer term ideas of the museum and making sure though that there is a regular checking in, you know, maybe I write an email every 6 months or things like that, just to make sure that they don't feel like we exploited their intelligence, well-being, and, you know, all that they brought to the project. And then we don't care about them anymore. And this is really something that takes a lot of, you know, caring. It's a part of the curatorial work, of the caring part. It's caring about objects, but also people.
Yeah. And so do you find that you're doing that interaction sort of one-on-one in emails and meetings and seeing people in the community, or do you have any kind of formalized setting in which you regularly are checking in with?
No, I do it personally. I invite people to things that are not African related to, you know, make sure that, you know, they know that we're opening a South Asian exhibition, because there's also the thing, it's not because you're Black, you just care about African things, you know, you may actually be interested. So it's also trying to keep them abreast of the bigger, what's happening at the museum and why they should care about the museum, even if there's not an active Africa project happening for a year and a half, for example, because those things matter. And then we try to do what we call soft programs. So it's not exhibition related, but we would do lectures. We can do community events. We can have a party, a Friday Night Live party that it's Caribbean music or Afrobeat or something like that. So that these kind of themes and interests are still active with programming if there's no exhibition that really draws the attention at that point.
Mm-hmm. Lance, did you want to ask a question on that?
I was gonna follow up and say I agree. It's effort. I think that's key. Is like you're constantly talking to these individuals or your community partners. I think once again my uniqueness is that I have civil rights veterans who are still alive who come to my museum and who see themselves on the wall, and so dealing with the complex of history, a lot of people don't know who they are. Or if they're not Dr. King, if they're not Rosa Parks, or they're not Malcolm X, it's kind of like, what do you fall at? And so constantly making sure that we're in communication, constantly that we're asking them to come to programs just to be there, and asking them for their opinions on programs. What would you like to see? And I think making them feel part of the space is key. And then, like, every once in a while, would you like to go get some coffee? Making sure that we are, like you said, curating their feelings and their emotions. It's not just about the object or the space, but it's also about human relationships. Mm. I had a question, but I honestly forgot my question.
Might come to you. A good pivot maybe for Linda and the exhibition that we just opened at the DeYoung Museum in San Francisco, Soul of a Nation, Art in the Age of Black Power. You might want to kind of add to that what we were working on in sort of the similar vein that what you were just saying, Lance.
Well, and yes. And what I want to highlight is we just recently opened, we're the 5th venue for the Soul of a Nation exhibition, coming from Tate Modern. And what we've assembled an advisory group. But I actually want to talk about how it wasn't executed in the right way and some learnings that came out of that. So I think we've had a history of really engaging the community through advisory groups for a very long time. And so for contemporary Muslim fashions, for example, we assembled an advisory group of local Muslim leaders of all different backgrounds, ages, etc. And I think that was a hugely successful advisory group, and one that we've been maintaining contact with and inviting to other exhibitions and understanding what are their needs, what are their motivators, and how do you continue that dialogue. And we're all strapped for time, and that's a real issue for most museum employees. So it's maintaining those relationships in and out of the museum, I think, is important. But now shifting over to our recent Soul of a Nation exhibition, and instead of doing an advisory group specific to Soul of a Nation, we actually assembled, the education department assembled a group that would be advising on a host of other forthcoming exhibitions. So for example, we have Frida Kahlo exhibition coming in the spring, and a Judy Chicago, et cetera, et cetera. And really thinking about how do we engage this group of community leaders from all different backgrounds and ask them to participate on an ongoing basis. I'm only speaking from hearsay and from collective kind of feedback and notes, because I was not present at that initial meeting. But the feedback that I received was there was a lot of opportunity for us as an institution to shift the way that we were dialoguing with our advisory group. So we had heard that there was a lot of talking at the advisory group and telling them about all the great things we were doing, but not really leaving a lot of room for listening. So I think in engaging communities, it's really important to not come at it as we're the institution, you're here to listen to us, and being extracting. I think it's really important to have, making sure that we're creating proper feedback loops and that we're allowing communities to actually surface things that may make the institution uncomfortable, may make us have to deal with things that we don't or haven't dealt with before. And I think that's what came out of our advisory group, was things that created some friction. And I think we need to welcome that as institutions, is the discomfort that might come with actual real engagement and two-way dialogue, and then having methods for changing and shifting the way that we approach our exhibitions, our didactics, our outbound communications based on real feedback that we get from our advisory groups.
And Lance has just posed to the group, and maybe to kind of piggyback off of that, how do we engage with specific, or how do we reach out to the invitees into the kind of community advisory groups? How do we select those individuals, and how are they invited to participate with us?
Well, I can answer from our standpoint. I think it's been something that's been run through our education department, because we have a long history of working with a variety of different groups within the community. Usually it's an assembled list based on, what the background, perspective, maybe engagement, civic engagement. And I'm not quite sure what the vetting process is for that group, but I know our education department certainly has a longstanding history of kind of assembling those groups, and have done a really good job of bringing in a wide variety of voices and people to represent the community. But I think it's actually a great question, just to understand how are institutions even assembling these groups, and what is the method, and then and is it something that can be more systematized and utilized across a variety of institutions?
Right.
I don't know if we need a system. I mean, I think sometimes advisories need to be tailored to what you're asking. And there is a value. I mean, they need to be selected carefully. I think a good advisory is an advisory that it's not of your friends. Maybe you need some friends, but you need some people that would speak their mind, that are not necessarily your usual cohort. People, I don't know, in the Of Africa advisory, we had academics, we had educators, we had people in the arts, we had community activists. That was kind of the range of people that we had, because we wanted also to make sure that we included people that would not be afraid to be critical. Because sometimes, you know, you put people in and they want to be nice, especially in Canada. Everybody's afraid of not being nice. But that's not useful. It's actually really great when you have people pushing back, when you have people that are saying, you may be doing this wrong, because that's the learning opportunity. That's when you can redress and correct, and you can actually shift and change things.
It's like this is a great kind of kismet moment, because somebody has asked a question for the group and to Linda, but I think also Sylvia, it's exactly what you're just saying. What do we do as museums when we have that friction with our advisors? How do you handle that in an appropriate way that becomes constructive for everybody involved?
Well, I can speak to it because we just dealt with that type of friction recently. And again, I was not present at that initial meeting, but from the follow-up and from the notes and from what the team kind of debriefed with me, there was a breakout session during that where community advisors were able to give input and feedback on what the museum was doing, what they were doing well, what they weren't doing well. And I think that there were some specific prompts. And my understanding from some of the notes gathered and kind of debrief meetings that I had after was there were some pretty specific negative feedback about the museum, saying, you know, the De Young or the, you know, De Young Museum, I'm speaking about the De Young specifically because we were, I think that the soul of a nation is being presented here, and folks felt that we oftentimes only bring groups together and talk about issues of race when we have an exhibition that is dealing with a specific demographic, and that we're not having these dialogues, authentic dialogues, in an ongoing basis. And of course, you know, as an institution, when you're sitting there and you're receiving this feedback, it's not comfortable, but it's that kind of truth serum, quote unquote, that we need. And we need to hear that. And I think at the end of the day, it's about how are we taking those real bits of feedback and looking at ourselves reflectively and saying, are we talking about race on a regular basis? Do we have a racial equity training in place for our staff so that our predominantly Caucasian staff feels empowered to have dialogue about topics that perhaps are uncomfortable? And I think that's museums are having to ask these questions across the country and globally, and how are you really being constructive with the feedback, and how are you implementing change through that feedback? And so in our particular case, after that meeting, we took the feedback, our director took the feedback, recognizing that perhaps it was a little bit more extractive than we would have wanted it to be, that there wasn't room for a lot of two-way dialogue. And he worked with our education department, crafted a follow-up letter, and basically said, you know what? We hear you. We recognize that perhaps we didn't do this in the best way that we should have, and we would like to invite you back and continue. And now we want to hear from you and make sure that we're allowing you the opportunity to communicate with us regularly and candidly, etc. So I do think that museums have to be open, leadership has to be open to receiving constructive and sometimes critical feedback, and kind of responding head on and not being afraid, and really taking it to heart and figuring out how to institute change through that feedback.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone else want to add to that? In a challenging situation, you know, how do you respond appropriately, and how do you learn from that, listen, and then kind of take what can be kind of hard to hear and implement it or pivot with it?
I mean, I think what Linda said is the way to go. It's not always easy. It depends on the level of the criticism and the friction. I think sometimes there are easier things to fix. And if the friction is related to content of an exhibition, for example, or a theme, or the way an exhibition is done. We had an example that wasn't in my department, but a very close colleague of mine recently, about an exhibition on Japanese internment in Canadian camps during the Second World War. And so there was an advisory committee that was struck, And they had real issues with the content of the exhibition, not the content, but the framing of the exhibition in a way, the sentiment that was coming through with the exhibition. It was too adulterated. It was too soft. It wasn't, it didn't bring the pain out enough, according to our advisors. And so we stopped the exhibition, and we took 6 more months, and we just opened later, and we addressed the calendar, and it wasn't a show must go on kind of situation. We just all agree, okay, let's go back to the drawing board. Let's bring these people in. Let's find funds to pay these people so that we're not just asking them for advice, but we're paying them as advisors. And let's rethink how we can do this in a way that is sensitive to these issues. And I think this is what we can do. There is a friction, we should listen, and we should try to address it. There are bigger systemic issues that are not so easily resolvable, like how diverse is your staff? How, those things take longer time and a very strong concerted effort on the part of senior management and HR. And those things are discussed at levels that are often beyond curatorial. What we can do as curators, though, is make sure that the content and the messages and the way we approach people is respectful, and that we change our message and what we say based on what people tell us.
That's helpful. There's been another question from our audience members about when a checklist for a show like Soul of a Nation is created, is there room for response from advisors, or are we only really responding to kind of advisory feedback in terms of our public programming? So I guess the question is about the checklist. And I was not the curator of the show, so I don't feel poised to answer that specifically, but I think what we could say, and maybe Linda, you want to add to this too, is that we were conscious about putting in a really Bay Area perspective to the exhibition. And so there definitely was some feedback and dialogue that went around that, but it really has been more focused on our programming only because this is an exhibition that was organized by Tate Modern. And so it kind of came to us as a fully developed project. But I think that's a really great question to think about. Does the community engagement on a global, local issue actually, can it tangibly affect the content of a project, not just the kind of world around it, but actually what you're presenting in the exhibition? Does anyone have a thought to add to that?
I have a thought to add to that. I think that's an excellent question, and in an ideal world, we would be able to engage our community advisors, perhaps in some capacity. What I do know is, so as Melissa noted, this was a show, a traveling exhibition. We had some adjustments to it, but we did not specifically engage the advisory group on the content of the show itself. However, the research firm out of the UK, Morris Hargrave McIntyre, that we've been working with, and they work with museums globally, one of the things that they do as part of their research is actually at a very, very early stage when curators are coming up with a concept of the show, not to change the show, but to test it out with certain audiences and gather initial feedback and sentiment. Like, are we hitting on something here that has traction? If we micro tweak it this way, could it have even more traction? So they do some of that pre-work research with organizations. Usually larger institutions like the V&A and the Tate have activated that, and it's part of their planning process, and they've allocated budgets to do some of that early, just touching base with audiences and soliciting feedback early on to be able to make some micro adjustments. So for example, I don't remember which institution, but my contact at the research firm was sharing with me that there was a Leonardo da Vinci exhibition at a museum, and they were focusing on, X, Y, and Z on Leonardo da Vinci, but they actually failed when they did this kind of initial testing. They realized, wait, no one knows Leonardo as the human, as the man, his thinking. And they shifted, that was the research that came back, and people really wanted to know more about him as a person. And so they micro tweaked the exhibition direction to incorporate more about him as the man and kind of the background, because that's what drove people's curiosity. They wanted to know his thinking, and that actually helped shape the exhibition longer term. And it was at its core, it was the same, but it's the positioning that shifted. And I do think that there's an opportunity for museums to do some of that pre-planning, and really building that into and creating feedback loops early in the cycle, so that it's not this beautifully packaged, delivered, thought through exhibition, and then it's delivered to the front facing side of the museum to kind of package and deliver to the public. And then it gets to the public, and the public is like, I could care less about this, or I don't really understand, or it's missing X, Y, and Z. So I do think that there is a nice opportunity for research to help shape positioning. It doesn't mean we change, the direction, but we change we micro tweak things based on what viewers might want to see more of.
Mm-hmm. Any thoughts to add to that? I just want to have a time check that we're at 11:48 Pacific Standard Time. So we have about 12 minutes left in the webinar. So if anyone has any questions, don't wait till the last minute, keeping an eye on the Q&A box. But I am also cognizant that we are broadcasting to a wide range of museum professionals at all levels. And I think that the idea that programming is something that can be shaped within an organization might feel challenging to more junior members of staff, that curators at a more senior level might actually be implementing programs and projects that are about these topics. But do you have any suggestions for members of staff, curatorial or otherwise, about how they can contribute to this kind of a dialogue, maybe not at a level at which you're proposing exhibition topics or something like that?
Well, I'll jump in. One thing that I thought was really impactful and effective and empowered, so part of my role is overseeing our visitor experience team, which is the front lines. So dealing with, everyone who's communicating to the public, taking tickets, etc. And one of the things that we activated for contemporary Muslim fashions that I thought was really effective, and it empowered people at all different levels, whether in the administrative staff or on the front lines, or any department anywhere, is we instituted staff training, cultural sensitivity training, led by the American Islamic Relations executive director. And it was kind of demystifying Islam for staff. And it really, she was an excellent speaker, and she poked fun at certain things and helped explain other things, and really, define terms, and helped people be able to ask any question they wanted without feeling stupid or without feeling like it was off limits. And I think doing these kind of organization-wide trainings on maybe subjects that nobody really wants to raise their hand and say, you know what, I don't know what to ask, and I feel uncomfortable. It does empower staff at all levels to then come out of those trainings feeling like they can ask questions or engage the public in a way that will be helpful for the institution, without feeling like, oh no, I'm going to step on somebody's toes. I don't know, why do we need to have a prayer room? And if someone's asking about that, that's a visitor, or even able to define some basic terms like the, hijab, or why, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's really power in educating and not assuming that staff know all of the nuances and subjects around certain exhibitions, and offering them an opportunity to be educated so that they can then turn around and communicate not only with visitors or other staff members, but also with their family and friends, and getting people engaged on a whole nother level.
Mm-hmm. I'll just add at this moment that actually we're going to run until 15 minutes after the hour, so we have a lot more time for questions. But just to get everybody thinking about what questions you might want to be asking. Lance or Sylvia, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, like in the museum where I work, which is a big hierarchy and complex machine, programming is usually actually not organized by curators unless it's exhibition related. But programming is a much broader category and concept. And community engagement, programming is part of community engagement, but it's not, so we actually have a community engagement cross-departmental committee that includes people from marketing, from programming, from education, from curatorial, from management, and we meet every month. And we're actually thinking of a broader institutional community engagement strategy that cuts across all these different departments or cross sections of the museum. So really starting to think of community engagement, not as something that is any one department's job, but it's the museum's job. And this in a way also dovetails with what Linda was saying, you know, having opportunity for all staff to be trained on specific issues. Like now the ROM is undergoing, I don't know how voluntarily, or is this part of the TRC instructions, but we're doing Indigenous training. Everybody in the museum is supposed to do Indigenous training. And we have fantastic Indigenous educators here at the ROM that have been working in the gallery. But it's really also about shifting the burden, for example, of certain staff to carry that responsibility, that it has to be shared by everybody. So it's not just our Indigenous educator that have to teach people to be sensitive to Indigenous issues, or that have to claim the space for different types of interpretations and conversations. But it has to be something that we all collaborate to do. And these spaces, these training opportunities that are 4-hour sessions that we're all doing in groups of 30, we are 440 employees. So it's a big effort of the institution, but it's really helpful because those are spaces in which we're talking to one another and also confronting our fears, our uncomfortable moments, but also learning that it's our responsibility as much as our colleagues, Indigenous colleagues' responsibility to shape the museum according to this new vision.
That's just to answer to that, that's really exciting to hear, Sylvia, because that is something that I think institutionally we would love to activate here. And I've seen a few models across different organizations that seem to really work, is when you think about it as a unified approach and not just you know, one department delivers the package and then kind of takes it on the map, but actually thinking about some of these questions and opportunities for dialogue early on. I think that's great. So I will take that and as words of advice for our organization here as well.
And I think to piggyback off of Sylvia, it's different departments across the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, which I work for. But I'm a curator that does exhibitions, programming, and we do other stuff as well. One of the things that we have been implementing in the department is a diversity task force, and really what does that look like across the board for all employees? I think when diversity and equity is like buzzwords lately in the field, and what does diversity mean? And I think people normally think diversity usually is black and white, particularly in Mississippi, right? But we are making sure that it isn't just about race, but it's about gender, age, class, where you're coming from. So we're making sure that everybody's going through that training, and that we all have some type of say in that training as well. Because just because I'm a Black man, I'm African American, doesn't mean I know what diversity means. But going across that stigma and having those conversations, I think is key. And I'm gonna probably steal some of the things that you said too, Sylvia, and try to implement them in my space.
Who's, if I can ask, who's on your committee? Is it voluntary participation, or
it's voluntary? So it's curators, it's our education team, it's our public resource officers, it's our team in our archaeologists, our preservation team makes up different people in finance. And so what does that really mean across the board for the department?
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, it's been around since 1902. And so there's a lot of stigma people still think of the department, but that's not really what's happening once you really see what's going on behind the scenes.
We at the Fine Arts Museums have an idea committee, which, you know, I think, again, is really a buzzword now, but diversity, equity, access, inclusion, diversity, equity, and access. And I think that the ideas that the idea committee have been percolating are really interesting, because they do, you know, it kind of daylights within your own organization questions that your colleagues have about how do we make decisions about what goes on the wall, what kinds of programming we're doing, what kinds of exhibitions we're doing. And it really does start to make you think really critically about how we can shepherd those conversations, and then also how we make those decisions more clear to our colleagues, and then even externally too. So I think that another question that might be pertinent to ask the group is that when we have these kind of niche projects, or what might be perceived as a niche project, when you take something like contemporary Muslim fashions, for example, that you might think that it's a project that you really filtered toward a certain demographic or a certain type of audience member, but you want that kind of a project to have a more global resonance. It's not just for a Muslim community. You want everyone to feel like this is an exhibition that they can come away from it with learning something. So I'm wondering if there are some case studies that you could share about how you take a project that feels very specific to perhaps a particular community and make that feel accessible and relevant to a broader constituency. Just a simple question.
Let's go.
Yeah.
Well, I think the opportunity for us was really twofold. One was to, what I wrote down here in my notes was opportunity to kind of transform a fear or lack of cultural awareness to curiosity and cultural awareness among general audience and staff. So I think taking a subject like Muslim fashion, there's Muslim fashion? These women, you know, like designers all over the world, even just basic things like understanding that the majority of Muslims don't reside in the Middle East, which most people, that's what they assume. And really educating our audience to the beauty and the expression of, completely different background. And then represent Muslim cultures authentically and engage with a Muslim audience. So it was really both. It was about education, demystification, and illumination for general audiences, and then really authentic representation for the Muslim audience. And I think it's an opportunity for museums on any variety of fronts, whether, whatever the topic may be, to really find that balance between how do you represent authentically, and then how do you illuminate for those that perhaps are not, don't have a background or don't understand what that subject matter is on. And that's at the core, the role of an institution like a museum is to be able to showcase and educate and foster dialogue and then be arbiters of change through that process.
Yeah, I mean, at the ROM, we are a world art museum, so we do present topics that are not specifically Canadian focused all the time. And I think what Linda was saying, trying to strike a balance in the way you present the exhibition that doesn't assume any one audience, but that works with different audiences, that can provide different things, different levels of messaging, and that can reach true across the board. So if you do not know anything about, I don't know, Imperial China, you will learn something. And if you are from the Chinese community, you may actually discover new and beautiful pieces that you've never seen. So depending on how much your previous knowledge of the topic, what you bring into the exhibition, you will find something beautiful and surprising and be able to communicate that. I mean, the marketing of exhibitions is always a really challenging thing, and to strike the right marketing balance can be a real challenge. It's not my job, thank goodness. And sometimes we have to change marketing halfway through, you know, because ultimately there's also this thing that we need to bring audiences in, that we need people to come to see the exhibition for the museum to stay open and survive. So there are different needs that need to be met, and there is an intellectual need, there is a community engagement need, but ultimately we want our exhibitions to be successful, because that's what's going to keep us making more exhibitions, so, and not closing the door. So it's always that complicated and difficult balance. And sometimes, yeah, sometimes certain topics we will not touch or we cannot do because our marketing team doesn't think that we will reach enough people with that topic, or we try to balance, you know, things that we know will bring in big public, like dinosaurs, with Asafo flags from southern Ghana. And so the dinosaurs allow us to do the Asafo flags. And, you know, we put different weights on different exhibitions, but you try also to create a program globally that touches, maybe not every exhibition can do all that, but you can do it within a year. You can make sure that you're balancing things for different types of needs.
I know I have the luxury of working for two museums in the same space. And so our history museum allows us to touch on different topics, right? So we have a phrase over there, many stories, but one Mississippi. And so we're able to focus on the Chinese and the Delta, the Lebanese, the Greek, the Italians, which allows us to draw from the permanent space, then allow to create exhibitions, right? And so one of the exhibitions that we'll be focusing on is Prohibition in Mississippi. But when we normally think Prohibition, people normally think of just white Southern men in Mississippi. But it is affecting the African American community, it's affecting the Chinese community, it's also affecting indigenous peoples community. So in that exhibition that's going to be launched in March, you're going to see the various communities that Prohibition is going to affect. And so I think if you're able to draw from your space or your collection, or even sometimes in the civil rights museum, we have our last guy was called "Where Do We Go From Here?" dealing with civil rights. We're able to touch the Chino movement in California on the West Coast. We're able to affect the LGBT plus community different ways. And so it's opportunities there, but you just have to be creative enough to figure out how do you touch those topics that are not always addressed in your museum. Hope I answered that question.
Creativities and kind of technologies, are there any new methods or media that your museums have been using to make your collections or your programs more accessible to global audiences? Or, you know, what's kind of the most effective tool right now?
I think besides social media, like Facebook and Instagram, we do a distant learning project that we have a distant learning project that we're launching. One of my colleagues in the education department, they just did a distant learning opportunity with some students in Brazil, where they actually walked them through the museum and found connections of civil rights and human rights dealing with Brazil history, right? And so that's a form that we've been doing. One of the things that I'm working on is trying to implement VR and AR in our museum, and trying to, especially exhibitions, like our temporary exhibitions, how do we bring the space into the classroom where students can come? Particularly in Mississippi, if you're from North Mississippi, it may take you an hour or 2 hours to get to Jackson, Mississippi. And then you have to get back on the bus, and the day's over. You really don't have time to enjoy the museum. But one of our big grantees is Kellogg. And so Kellogg has given us grants for buses. And so we are helping Tier 1 schools, Title I schools, get to the museum by paying for their field trip, getting them transportations, and that's how they get here to our museum. So it's about accessibility as well, what we're basically dealing with.
it's literally the physical process of getting people to the museum, but then there's also a digital component of sharing the museum to people that can't get closer. So what tool did you use for the exchange, the distance learning with the students in Brazil?
I believe it was just Skype. They Skyped in and they walked around through the museum. And so I'm also going to be, me personally, going to be Skyping in with one of my colleagues in Barbados and giving a virtual tour in the next month on and what's the relation between human and civil rights, but particularly Mississippi and Brazil.
Sylvia, what have you
Not
been?
Brazil, Barbados.
Oh, sorry. What has your museum, Sylvia, been doing to kind of take the local and make it global, or vice versa?
We do distance learning as well. We've been doing it a lot. I mean, it's Northern Ontario, so Ontario is big. So Northern Ontario is really, really far, and we've been collaborating with communities in Northern Ontario and doing distance learning program for quite a while now, mostly in the science departments. We have an active social media. We have actually 2 people that do social media full-time here at the ROM, and using a variety of platforms. We also, as Lance said, have programs. I mean, there's still things that are low tech that work very well. We do exhibitions that travel. There are in a couple of suitcases. So when people cannot come to the museum, we bring the museums to more distant communities. And that's been a program that has been ongoing for 30 years. And these exhibitions are still booked all the time. So sometimes there's also something to be said about having the opportunity of engaging with objects and collections, or a portion of it. I think as museum professionals, we tend to like objects, but we're not the only people that like objects. So sometimes technology cannot substitute what it means to have the opportunity of engaging with artworks and having those in front of you. So we've been developing different programs that allow for that flexibility to occur. They're low-tech things, but they still work. And I guess they go back also to that human relationship and being able to then, bring something to a community, maybe with an educator or with somebody that interprets it for them. So it's really physically the museum going somewhere, and it still is very important.
Yeah.
I'd like to chime in on this as well. I know that there's a couple other questions that have cropped up, but just to wrap this specific question, I like to view the institution and the messaging and the way that we connect with audience as kind of the core or the middle, the center part of a wheel. And then all the spokes going out are the different channels and different methods by which we communicate and engage people, whether it's locally, regionally, nationally, or internationally. And so a couple of examples that are, at least one example that hasn't been mentioned in this, I think the exchange idea with different cities and kind of interpreting each other's collection and learning from each other's collection is a really excellent idea. But good old-fashioned PR, public relations, and earned media. So just to go back to contemporary Muslim fashions, because it was really resonated on a global scale and it really hit on something. And so we were able to generate 3,000 nuanced, long-form news stories in publications like Vogue and Elle and Mademoiselle, and publications that don't typically cover art in depth, and really be able to share with a whole host of new audiences through earned media and through storytelling. I mean, ultimately, we needed to tell the story and the importance of why we were doing this exhibition at a specific time. And I think oftentimes communications is viewed as a method of getting people through the door, but it's also a brand builder. It's an awareness builder, and it's a way to educate audiences, perhaps in other countries. So we did a global PR campaign and had stories in Germany and Singapore and all over the world, people that wouldn't ever cross the threshold and see the exhibition, but that could be educated on the topic of the exhibition. So I think that's a really important way to get the word out.
Now that we're at about 5 minutes, I'm going to ask two in tandem questions that save the best for last in a way. And these I think are really challenging and maybe even more philosophical. But there's a good question posed by one of our attendees asking about when you're in a more homogenous community or potentially more conservative community, how do you engage and respect your audience's viewpoints while also challenging them to expand their understanding on a given topic? And then I think I'd kind of add to that context, what is our responsibility as museums? What do we have a responsibility to bring to our kind of communities, and do we take a particular stance? And I credit Lance for this question, which is a challenging one. But how do we engage in these sometimes challenging conversations, and what is our responsibility to do so as museums? Who wants to go first?
I go first. I'll go first. I deal with those kind of questions or those moments all the time. I am constantly asking questions, right? I'm gonna give you the facts because that's what I'm supposed to do. Give you the facts, but I also then bring contemporary issues. So like if I'm talking about lynching, for example, I always ask, okay, what is a lynching? And then 9 times out of 10, I hear hanging. Then I say, okay, let's take that a little bit further. It's killing you with no due process of law, right? And then I'm saying that's basically homicide or murder. And so if you think about it, then I make them say names with me. I say Trayvon Martin is lynched with no due process. Then I say Eric Gardner is lynched with no due process. And so I'm constantly having dialogue, and I'm constantly trying to bring the past into our present moment. And then I'm always asking, let's see, what's another thing that I'm asked? I'm constantly asked the flag question, the Confederate flag. And then I constantly ask them, okay, what is treason? And so we're constantly going back and forth and having dialogue. Being in Mississippi for almost 2 years, I expect any question really. But you have to have your moment where you breathe. But I'm always proposing questions to my audience for them, make them think and ask them how they're feeling and how they're going through the process, and then relate it to the physical space of the content.
Lance, it sounds like you are basically you're leading them to the water's edge, right? Mm-hmm. You're kind of holding their hand and letting them start to think about things in their own way by asking the right questions and leading them to the water. And I think that museums I feel fortunate to work in a community in San Francisco where there's a lot of diversity of thought and a wide variety of people from all different backgrounds. But I do think that the institution's role is not to assert any one idea or opinion on people, but to help open their minds, open their thinking so that they can arrive at new perspectives with a guiding and helping hand when they're ready. And it's really not force feeding. It's about slowly taking them on a journey of exploration and illumination.
I agree.
Sylvia, do you want the last word?
I have nothing to add. I think this was a wonderful conversation. I'm so glad to have met you virtually.
I hope that this has been a useful panel for all of our colleagues who chimed in today. As a reminder, it will be accessible on the AAMC website, so you can go back and revisit it multiple times. I'm so grateful to each of our panelists for contributing their thoughts, ideas, and experience today, and I'm also grateful to AAMC for helping us host this panel. I look forward to chiming in to some future AAMC webinars, and hopefully we'll see everybody at the conference next year. Thanks. I guess we'll sign off and say goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.